So I'm going to start off by saying just up front that I acknowledge how much positive comes from technology. I've been involved in helping to build this. Just look around us at Stanford, everything that we have. Because throughout the talk, some of you who are in the room or not in the room are going to be thinking, yes, but, and thinking that I'm not giving both sides. Well, this talk is not about all the positives, so I'm just saying it one up front that I'm acknowledging that there is lots of positives, and some of us see different positives than others. So I may bring up issues that I think are less positive, but again, starting off acknowledging it. And I think that also those people who have looked at the slides online or see the word digital pollution immediately think that what I'm going to talk about is all of the digital toxins, that the content itself is the pollutants. And actually, the term digital pollution, and I will get into this later, is more a metaphor for how to think about this area and how we move forward with solutions in the notion of pollution having to do with byproducts of industrialization or byproducts of progress. And as with industrialization, where we are now seeing dire consequences of the costs that come with that progress, I believe that we have similar problems with our digital progress and the application of digitization. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to do this in three pieces. First, I just want to talk a little bit about digitization because I believe, as I just mentioned, that it's as profound a shift as industrialization was. So we like to, on one hand, we often think there's nothing new ever. We've been through this before, we'll figure it out again. On the other hand, there are times in which we have more significant shifts, often caused by some new type of technology. And I think we are at that point again as we moved into industrialization. And notice I keep using the word digitization. I'm not talking about specific technologies here. I'm talking about how we apply digital technology. So it's about the technologies and the use and the business models around them that are the issues here, and not necessarily just the technologies themselves. Sorry, I realized I'm holding this. The second part is, after I talk about digitization, I'm going to talk a little bit about digital pollution, what are the issues, and how I think we might think about moving forward. And then I want to end, because we are at Stanford, and to talk about what is our role as technologists. What can we do and what can't we do to help solve this problem? So just 2 slides on my background, not going to go into in detail, but one of the things you'll see filtered through this is we very much are products of our perspectives. And so I just want to give you a sense of where my perspectives come from. Most people see my background and know of me as an entrepreneur, and perhaps my board seats involved with Disney or FedEx and as CTO of Cisco. But I've had experience with innovation and across all 3 sectors. So yes, my career was primarily entrepreneurial, starting a lot of companies, had exposure to the corporate world, and then had exposure to the academic and nonprofit world through both my own work. I'm an academic brat. Both my parents were involved in the academic world, and through advisory work and the board at KQED. And then I can't talk about informing my perspectives without also mentioning that I'm a mother of a millennial who doesn't like to be called a millennial, but certainly a view into the use of technology of that generation through my son. So somewhere around the mid-2000s, around 2005, I stopped actively running the companies that I was building. I kind of picked up my head, was able to look around a little bit more because I wasn't in an intense operational role. And as I did that, I also started to think more about the consequences of some of the technologies that and the industry that I was involved in. And that began with my book in 2008 called Closing the Innovation Gap, which one of the main points there was that our innovation ecosystem was off balance, that we were reaping the seeds of so much that we had created, but we weren't planting new seeds, that we weren't investing in the long term. We were becoming more short-term focused. Then in 2014, I gave a TEDx talk that was called Balancing Our Digital Diets. One of the things when I look back at that talk is that I actually have a statement in there about lies moving faster than the facts that can correct them. And little did I know then how big an issue that was going to be. So again, seeing at that point, it wasn't just our innovation ecosystem, but new digital technologies such as social media and others were coming into the fore. And last year, with the election in 2016, with all that has come out about whether it is privacy issues or democracy issues, I won't go into them right now. It was an awakening of this is serious. This is not just, okay, we need to think about this. We need to start waking up. And so I have two pieces that I've published on this. One that's called Authoritarian Technology, and that is not technology by use by authoritarian governments. That is that our relationship with technology is authoritarian. It's unbalanced. It is submissive in terms of a bullying, controlling relationship. And when I say our, I mean us as users. I mean us as society, and the checks and balances that need to go along with new products. So as I was thinking about how to kind of kick off what is the issue here? Why is this, what is it about our culture that is so impacted by digitization? And I started thinking about all of the words that we use, our lexicon, whether it's in Silicon Valley or throughout our culture, that we now think of as good. And whether it is scale, speed, disruption, measurements, tracking, data-driven, all the words that you hear every day, not just in tech companies and not just in other businesses, but nonprofits who want to be more and more data-driven and impact-driven, or campaigns that need to be all data-driven. So across the spectrum, these words have now become a lexicon for our society, as have the things that we think they're in service of, or they are in service of, but we all think of as good. Who questions productivity, efficiency, convenience, impact, profitability, no friction, all of those things? We normally would throw around these words and it's like, good, that's all goodness. But at what cost? And that is what I want to talk a little bit about. So I was very fortunate to start my career in the 70s at a time when digital technologies and information technologies were helping enterprise decision making. And that was really the first broad use of computer technology. And enterprises were able to make better decisions to improve their products, customer satisfaction, employee contribution. So if you think about the 70s and the 80s. And then with the internet and the web came in, and we added into that a very powerful means of consumer outreach, of content distribution. That's the point at which individual adoption of these technologies took hold. And then the next phase, I would say we've moved to, if you look at our technologies today, essentially a total infusion of content, processes, and behavior. So it's not just about how we read things or how we get in information, but it really has become completely integrated with how we live our lives. Now, along with that, those transitions were also transitions in the incentives in the market. And if we go back to the 70s and 80s, companies were judged on profit and often even fundamentals. People investing and analyzing companies actually understood the companies and looked at the strategy and the fundamentals. We then moved to a point at which really it was about a measure of growth. And in some ways, as the markets became more automated, more data-driven, then it became easier to just measure growth. It's harder to kind of understand the nuances of fundamentals if what you're trying to do is do computer program chaining as opposed to humans making those recommendations. And then somewhere along the line, we switched to growth wasn't enough. It was about momentum. It was about ever-increasing growth. And so the companies and the people making decisions are being driven by incentives that are influencing them to just think about growth and momentum and dominance above all. So why do I, normally when you see the increasing power in slides that we show, usually we like up arrows. Why do I have a down arrow? Because I feel that with this has come a slippery slope that has created some of the problems that we've seen. And in that last bucket, as the technology shifted in terms of our how we use it, how infused it is in our culture, there's also been a paradigm shift in the culture, in the way we think about technology and the way, frankly, technology companies are run and the decisions that are being made. So from a tech perspective, what are the things that have created this shift? It's the things we know. It's social, it's mobile, it's cloud, sensors in the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. Now, one of the interesting things about all of these technologies is that they all play into a world where they enable scale, but scale drives an advantage with each one of these technologies. So there's no question that scale and the amount of data that you have is going to enhance certain types of AI. That cloud has to do with scale and scope and speed. And so we're at a time when there are other ways to implement these technologies, but the way we're implementing it means the big get bigger, the power begets more power. Now, I mentioned that there's also been a shift in the culture. If you go back to the 80s, one of my favorite quotes from Steve Jobs was him telling a story of how technology should be like a bicycle for the mind. And that's because someone had done a study of locomotion of different mammals, and I think the condor was up front, on top, and humans came in at like 17. But when a human was riding a bicycle, all of a sudden they were number one. And so he used that as an example of what technology can do for us and can do for our minds. But somewhere along the line, we started hearing the luminaries of the valley not talk about bicycles for the mind, but talking about software eating the world. And every company is a tech company. And there became this shift to dominance, to a more aggressive type of stance. We, in this time, moved from an open philosophy, an open systems philosophy that drove the internet and the web, to a more walled garden proprietary philosophy. Now, many people will say, but look at how open we are today and how much we use open source. Open source is not the same as open systems. An open API is not the same as an open systems philosophy where people can can collaborate together as peers, as opposed to me having the power and yes, I will let you access that power or rent that power temporarily, where you are dependent on me. Platforms and network effects became a big issue in how people were driving their companies, how they were building the moats, whether or not a venture capitalist would invest in you. So focusing on where you can build those lock-ins became decisive factors in the companies that could be that were funded and how they grew, and that leads to increased consolidation. The business model shift to free consumer services, where the user is not paying any money, it's free, but we have less power because it's very different than when you are a customer who is paying dollars. Now again, not all the companies share all of these, and I'm not talking about a specific technology or a specific company, but when you look at the major companies and forces out there, they share different characteristics here. The co-opting of peer-to-peer distribution, community, personalization. Why do I say co-opting? Because these are, again, all things that we've been told are good for us, but what they're doing is propagating a model of data consolidation, but not just data and knowledge, because it's the aggregation of this data and the ability to turn that data into knowledge that is really so powerful. And that has become the currency. That has become the power. And through all this, it suddenly, as I was thinking about it, I realized how we've always talked about how important creative destruction, that was a slip. Creative disruption is to our economy, is to our society. Well, it feels like we've shifted from creative disruption to narcissistic disruption, meaning the disruption that's being done is for the benefit of the disruptor. It's not benefiting the people whose problems are being solved. Not that they don't get any value from it. That's not what I'm saying. But if you look overall, the value is more, again, accruing to those who are disrupting. And whether it is disrupting society or disrupting the news business or disrupting yet another industry, it's not clear that society overall is benefiting from that disruption. And along this whole time, we basically have lost our ability to have any checks and balances. And I believe as I go around talking to whether it's individuals, academics, people in government, people in nonprofits, there's an inevitability to tech. And actually, we in the tech industry have created that narrative. And we make things go faster and faster, and any progress is good progress. But if you put tech on a pedestal, then there are not the checks and balances that you need for society. We talk a lot about unintended consequences, but the fact of the matter is a lot of the issues that arise are not just unintended consequences, but consequences of intended use. And so through this time, some of the new techniques that have turned people into users, whether it's gamification, curation and recommendation is so critical because we've got so much information. You open up the floodgates, you have lots of choices. All of a sudden, making sense of all of those choices becomes a harder and harder issue. And predictive AI, as it is applied to curation and recommendation, has a lot of positives and a lot of side effects that we'll come back to. Micro-targeting, the ability to go, what Madison Avenue would have just died for. It's so beyond a focus group to have that ability to target and to zone in and get immediate feedback on that along with the techniques, our culture of how we develop and our methodologies also have impacted what we're doing. So agile, we all need, everything's moving faster. We need to be flexible. We need to be more agile. At its extreme, it can create a level of fragmentation that makes it so that it's harder to think through consequences because we're not thinking of things as a system. We're moving very quickly to implement our single piece. The minimal viable products, iterating on things, a lot of the culture that started in startups as lean startups and having a lot of benefits, when it's taken and put on a pedestal and applied to things where it doesn't belong, you can, again, lose system thinking and end up not having the strategic elements that you need for different industries. Couple that with moves fast and break things, that it's easier or even better to ask for forgiveness than to get permission. You know, all makes sense when you're building a software startup. But you can't just say, oops, I broke democracy, and you can't undo harm when you're talking about lives or elections. And so there are areas that you cannot apply the same type of culture. You need a different type of system when you're talking about the implications being as dire as they are. And then just a last on the culture, as we've moved towards maximizing speed and scale in organizations, we've also been going through a period of time where we've thought a lot about diversity and how do we get more diversity in organizations, and then people wonder why we haven't really moved the needle. Well, I would argue that organizing for maximum speed and scale actually works against heterogeneous, diverse environments. Because when you're moving really quickly and when you're growing very big, it has to be more formulaic, it becomes more hierarchical, and it works against making it more diverse. I think that one of the best ways to sum up the valley today, or the way tech and humans interact, is the notion of friction. So from an industry perspective, we want to make everything frictionless. I mean, and that's a mantra, make it frictionless. Build an app and take all the friction out of something. If you're a large platform, automate everything. Remove any barriers to onboarding content, onboarding users, including making it free. Engagement and addiction being, yes, I meant to say addiction, but focusing on engagement, which leads to addiction, is another form of that in terms of just taking the friction out of people using your product more and more. Now, this plays into our human nature to desire convenience. We want what we want, and we want it now. But you may want to eat potato chips and ice cream all day, but you probably don't. Just because your taste buds are addicted to sugar and salt because there was a time that's what we ate, your mind kicks in and you decide that you're going to eat whatever balance you decide you're going to eat. So this desire for convenience, if we don't understand the consequences, or if we're so addicted to something, we shut down that cognitive friction that comes in, is a dangerous combination. There is a difference between freedom and individuals and getting what we want and doing what we want, and free fall. And the fact of the matter is that friction is not a bad word. The right amount of friction is critical, whether you're riding a bike and the brakes or walking down a hill. And if you try too hard to avoid friction, you end up with hard stops. You end up with overcompensating. And Things like rules and norms are the guardrails, are the friction you need for a functioning society. Impulse control is friction inside of us. You can't work through a relationship without some amount of friction. Tolerating boredom, effort, pain, all involves friction. And I worry that actually what happens if the next generation or the generation after that has evolved so you work to avoid any effort, to avoid any friction, because we get so focused on convenience as a value. And that is really dangerous. You're going to become a parent? That's hard. There's all sorts of things that we can talk about that way. And the risks of unbridled capitalism are amplified because of the scope and pace of what is going on in this area. Okay, so I've had people come up to me and say, okay, so this is about privacy, right? How do we get these companies to be more transparent or protect our data and not have identity theft? Well, you know what? It isn't just about privacy, and it isn't just about being addicted to one's phone. It is a broader set of issues, and one of the reasons I decided to jump in a little bit more vocally in this space is I think there's a lot of good work being done on some of these issues. Again, whether it is addiction to phones, whether it is data privacy. But it feels to me like we tend to then get locked into just those couple of aspects, and that there is a broader set of issues here which involve economic, cultural, intellectual, and emotional health, our democracy and our national security. And these things interplay with our other big problems, our other big challenges, be it inequality, the future of work, the future of our planet. Because if we don't have a functioning society or democracy, if we aren't willing to embrace some amount of friction, we certainly are not going to solve those other problems. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but clearly I've mentioned loss of data privacy is a big issue, whether it is theft or the way that data is being used to target you. Addiction to phones and video games is real, and there's a lot you can go read about it. Mass manipulation in terms of marketing, it's been around for a long time. You now have platforms that just make that much easier to manipulate by bad actors. Sensationalization, there's so much noise, we all then naturally just yell louder to be heard. And it accelerates and accelerates and accelerates. Filter bubbles that we've all read about. Some of the things that we don't talk as much about is the level of anxiety and fear that these technologies actually play into. So we've heard a lot about FOMO. Somebody asked me what this other acronym is. It's one I made up, which is fear of losing economic or social status. And that fear of losing, sometimes it's the loss of it, sometimes it's just the fear of that loss, is a fundamental problem that we're seeing globally. And you could argue that there is a feed into what's going on from a populism perspective. Again, technology and digitization is not the sole cause of these things, but it amplifies or is one element in the things that I'm talking about. Fragmentation. If your news comes at you with different articles through your feed, interrelated with each other, with other news, you don't have the same sense of context of where that's coming from. Now you can say there's a brand associated. It's not the way we're taking in this information. So we tend to take things in fragments, and in that fragment you have a loss of context and a loss of trust. I would argue that the world is flattening. Our connectivity, our communications. We have a loss of nuance. That nuance is dimensionality that we don't have in so many of our communications and relationships. The amplification of the dark side of human nature is leading to just a basic loss of dignity. And then there's a propagation of all of our natural biases, some of which are okay, some of which are not okay in the propagation of the data. But there is a deeper level of all of this that are less obvious. I would compare this to what happened with the innovation in the food sciences to high fructose corn syrup. It took us a long time to realize the connection between that and diabetes or obesity. And I believe there are elements like that going on, whether it is personal agency that comes from addiction or the fear and anxiety, critical thinking, the ability to not blindly trust or not trust anything. We're in a situation now where there is a severe loss of trust in anything. But you need that combination of trust and mistrust to be able to not either, again, blindly follow somebody or not believe anybody. Facts do exist, and so does authoritarian propaganda. And we need to not be in any one of those things. Personal authority. When you look at how the AI-driven curation and personalization, this is not just a curation, what's happening is that in some ways, your conscious and unconscious behaviors are being fed into algorithms and machine learning, and then you're being told what to think, what you like, what to buy. Now, not everybody, many people see that and they're fine. They look at it, they may decide, you know what? I don't want to just look at the top 3 things that Amazon gives me. I don't want to just look at my news feed, and I'm going to go explore. I'm going to ask. Many people will do that, but a lot of people won't. And you become more and more driven to accept what is being told to you, which is not paying attention to your own unconscious, but feeding that into a machine that loops it back and tells you what to think. And so I believe that has a strong impact on, over time, our personal authority. Digitization of everything. Everything is 1-0, black, white, you're for, you're against. This again goes with the lack of nuance. I can listen to somebody and not agree with them, but maybe there's 10% of what they're saying has some interest to me. But if I immediately go to the other side, then I'm defending. And I really do believe that technology and digitization is playing a role in how that's developing. If you do not have critical thinking, if you don't know how to question and how to trust, and you have blind faith, you're more open to authoritarian leadership. And whether it is political, professional, your personal, social relationships, dogma in religion, it takes personal authority to have a balanced relationship. And so, again, some people may say they think that's the right direction. But if we believe in a society that we are looking to keep democracy as the primary means and want balance, we're going in the wrong direction. The impacts are not just on us as individuals, but this leads into it. It impacts how we operate collectively. So democracy requires access to information, common facts, and the ability to deliberate. And all the things I've talked about, you can have a sense of how that impacts our polarization, our fragmentation, which means we don't have a common context. We've ended up with essentially an alt reality where we're questioning whether facts matter or what is a fact. So misinformation, disinformation, all of the things that we hear a lot about today are not just transient. It's not just about today. It's about a fundamental breakage in what we need for a democracy to function. And we really need to think about that as this is not a partisan issue. Critical problems, as I mentioned earlier, whether it is climate or inequality, require collaborative action. They can't be solved top-down, and they can't be solved without people working together. If you oversimplify, none of these problems can be oversimplified or can be solved with simplification. If somebody says to you, well, just give me a 3-bullet answer. Well, there isn't a 3-bullet answer to the things that we're talking about. And it requires people being willing to deal with deferred gratification. A lot of these problems do not, and actually their immediate response is backwards a little bit, or more friction or less convenience before we end up in a better place. And something that we suffer from here in the Valley as much as anybody is what I call solutionism. Nobody wants to talk about anything unless you can give them an answer. So don't tell me about the problems. What's the answer? What's the answer? What's the answer? Well, you know what? Sometimes you need to talk about things for a while because there are a lot of smart people who are going to come up with different ideas, and there isn't a straightforward single solution. And we as entrepreneurs in the Valley, we're even more guilty about this, because if you're starting something new, you focus in. And as the country and the world has put entrepreneurship on a pedestal, that's the way we get everything done. We actually further drive a notion of solutionism. I'm not saying that we won't have solutions and that we don't need solutions, and you'll see in a minute that I'll talk about incremental versus long-term. But you can't just immediately say, don't talk to me about that complexity, tell me what the answer is, or I don't want to hear about it. And organizational problem solving has the same thing. This slide comes out of my book back in 2008, where I was talking about what are the core values of innovation. What does it take to have a capacity for change? And I identified through all of my interviews that it really is a balance of questioning, which is curiosity as well as self-assessment, non-judgmental, risk, openness to imagine, to new ideas, to sharing, patience, which is tenacity and patient capital, and trust in oneself and trust in others. And that you need to have a balance of those in an environment to create innovation. You can't just pick the one you like. Risk without questioning is gambling. Trust without questioning is blind faith. Neither one of those things are a healthy, innovative environment. And we like to think about the internet and technology as helping a free flow of ideas and encouraging innovation. Well, I would suggest you think about all the things I just talked about, and I'm not going to go through it, but think about how they map onto these core values. And are they enhancing them, or are they net creating a problem with our innovation? It's time to take this more seriously. I think you can tell that that's why I'm standing here today. And I think more and more we're hearing that. There are some great calls to action out there. I haven't listed them all, but a couple of the books that just came to mind that I was doing this from: Surveillance Capitalism, which focuses on the business model and how we got here, to Zucked, which is the story of Facebook but more broadly. Social media, Roger McNamee's book, and there are a bunch of others. But one of the things that I find with a lot of these books, and by definition, when you set out to write a book like this and come up with new ideas, they are very often targeted, but more importantly, they are advocating a very strong point of view, because you can't get people to listen unless you are putting all the data behind a single point of view. Now, I happen to like a lot of these books, that's why they're up there, and happen to agree with that point of view. And I have very strong points of view, as you can tell through this. But I think we're not going to solve the problems we have if we just go to our corners. And if we take one strong point of view against another strong point of view, we have to figure out how to get the collective people involved in this debate, which includes the tech industry, academia, government, us as individuals. It's a broad set of groups to talk and figure out how to solve this, because it's not all good or all bad. And the term digital pollution, which came from an article that I co-authored with Sam Gill, who's with the Knight Foundation, came out of a conversation we were having about what is a model, what is a paradigm for how we solve this. And if you think about industrial pollution is the recognition, and it started in the 1700s, and the recognition that there's a problem here, that there is a cost of progress. And then how do you resource it? How do you understand on an ongoing basis the problems? We created a field, environmental sciences, which informs the process. So we're informing the process with data and opinion. So we have lots of opinions, we have lots of passion. We also have people who study over periods of time what those pollutants are, what are the toxins, what are dangerous levels of those toxins. And then we debate. We endlessly debate. We move forward. We go backwards. Right here and now, it feels like we're in a backwards time when it comes to industrial pollution. But overall, it is a model that has at least worked in a lot of areas to make it less worse, at least in terms of the costs. And a key part of this is that you measure and assign a cost to the harm. You don't just celebrate growth, you don't just celebrate progress, but you understand the trade-offs. So that's why we coined the term digital pollution, as a way to think about this problem, and so that we can get people to not, again, just talk about good or bad, but try to understand what are our values, what are we losing that we as a society can't lose, and what are the ones that, you know what, we're going to lose some of that because it's worth it for the progress we're taking. Now, digital pollution's harder. It's harder because there's an accelerated pace. It's hard to keep up. The level of the paradigm shift were probably similar to the beginning of industrialization, but a lot of the work that's been going on industrial pollution, we already understood what industrialization was all about. I'm not sure we have the right language. A lot of the language and existing rules that we try to apply actually put us in the wrong direction. And the framing of the questions may hurt us. So we really need to rethink that. But the trickiest issue with digital pollution is, unlike industrial pollution, where the byproducts are not useful. They are the chemical byproducts from a factory are not something you want. Well, with digital pollution, often the harm and the good are from the same thing. And so it is really, really tricky to figure out how to separate those. How do we address this? What do we do about digital pollution? Again, not going into detail here, but one of the main things is to try to separate out the short term and the longer term. We need to be working on both in parallel. And in the short term, but not confuse the short term things as thinking they're long term solutions. So on the short term, we need to mitigate the damage, or mitigate any potential damage, and protect the vulnerable. So we need to empower people with information and tools. We need to demand incremental change from the industry. And who's we? We as a combination is people. And ultimately, people maybe influence regulators, but if you can do it from movements, whether it's healthy food movements or clean energy, that put pressure on the companies. This is easier said than done. And there are a number of areas where I think incremental change can be done without completely changing their business models. And we need to enforce and adapt current rules when they're applicable, because there are many current rules that just don't seem to apply because we don't know how to fit the current paradigm in. But we need to change the relationship. We need to take tech off a pedestal. We need to address the market dynamics and competition. We need a real checks and balances on these companies. We need a field of research. We need actively funding, and not just corporate funding, of people who study and identify where is the harm and how harmful it is. And we need to increase the tech capacity in governments and in civic society, because we're off balance, because it's complicated. And you have, those people who watch the hearings on the Hill and just thought everybody in Congress was just so embarrassing because they don't know what an iPhone is. And that is the reality TV part of the problem, but it's deeper. And we really need to increase that capacity. And this is an opportunity for human-centered technology. So let me finish by, as I mentioned, talking about our role as technologists. And as we have grown in power, we as an industry, the role of technology on the world, we have not taken the responsibility that comes with that power. For some, because they don't realize it. For others, because it's easier not to take that responsibility. So what can we do? One, I would challenge everybody to, in the industry and associated with the industry, to think, how are we being individually and collectively complicit? What is it that we're doing that maybe feeds into the narrative? The reason digital filter bubbles work is because we have psychological filter bubbles. We live in a world, we hear that lexicon, the people we talk to, and it's hard to, that's then the perspective in which you look at the world. And so recognizing that when you're reading things or looking at issues and starting to question whether the things we assume are good are all good, or whether there is only one way to do something, and that is maximum speed or maximum scale. We need to, a lot of people ask me whether I think industry people are bad people. And I think what we need to realize is it's not intentional or non-intentional. There is such a thing as unconscious intentionality that have to do with our incentives, have to do with where we've come from, where we are in the power system, that unconsciously makes us act a certain way, which is intentional, but it's unconscious intentional. And we just should be really, really aware of that. We need very serious thinking about ethics, starting ethics for technology industry, for computer sciences, but starting with values. It can't be just a checkoff item. And I hear a lot of conversation about, well, yes, we need to do ethics, so we're going to have a chief ethics officer in this company, or we're going to add ethics to a class, but not a lot of discussion about, well, what does it really mean? And what does it mean for this industry? And that takes some serious thinking. We're so used to celebrating disruption and blowing things up, and institutions are bad and nobody wants to move slowly. Well, there are implications for blowing something up if there's nothing there in between. People need glue. People need some type of friction and things that tie them together. So yes, institutions need to evolve, but just blowing things up without knowing what's going in their place doesn't work for a functioning society. And we need to keep people at the center as individuals and as a society. People talk about, do we need a user bill of rights? how about human rights? Starting with the fact that we're all users is actually not going far enough. Economic growth is important, but measuring GDP, why are we looking for economic growth? It should be in the service of overall well-being, which is a harder thing to have a metric on. And let's always remember that balancing power requires ongoing vigilance. Very rarely do people get power and then say, I have enough power. I don't want more power, or I don't want to keep my power. And so that's not a bad thing. That's human nature. And that's why you need checks and balances, whether it is a good friend that tells you you're getting arrogant and knocks you down to size a little, or whether it is checks and balances on large corporations. One of the things, actually I realized I went past a bullet there, which is we've got a lot of assumptions and norms in technology and business that we take for granted. We just should reflect on which of those ought to change. And one of them is how we think about metrics. We worship metrics. Metrics are the way we not only run companies, but often it's the way we run our lives, whether it's our Fitbit or the numbers that we're using to drive us. And we need to realize that they can make us myopic depending on what you choose. But if we're going to measure harm also, this is a place where we need some really clever people thinking about how do you measure harm? And how do you measure harm at scale? Because potential harm is, where do you look? How broadly do you look? And if you're, again, thinking from one perspective, it just may never occur to you to look somewhere else. Early detection, which is another way, which is you can't imagine the consequences, so you want to detect them early. Well, if you're doing that at scale, is an early sign an outlier or an early signal? And how do you detect that? What do you throw out? And then there are so many interrelationships that if you're focusing on one harm and you decide I'm going to get rid of that, well, that may exacerbate another one. And so being able to prioritize harm. So this is a hard issue, but we've got a lot of smart people, and we ought to start taking some of that smarts and applying it to think about it. One of the things that I think we struggle with is that how do you balance the focus and simplification of the benefits of metrics? Because part of metrics is driving behavior and driving incentives. So you can't have too many of them because you don't know what message you're sending. But for learning, you need more nuance. And so some of the organizations I've worked with, we've talked about try to differentiate, make sure you're differentiating between metrics and measurements. Measure a lot, but don't just throw it away. Make sure that you have mechanisms to go back to those measurements and look at them at the right time. And then you can simplify and decide what metrics at any given point in time you want to be driving behavior, and then use the understanding you get from that measurement to revisit and change those metrics. Tech alone cannot fix this. And it seems like the rest of the world is looking to Zuckerberg and saying, how are you going to fix this? And frankly, the technology industry wants people to leave them alone. And so they want, and they care, and they want to solve it. But one of my favorite quotes is an Einstein quote that says, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we used to create them. And that's part of the problem here. Tech needs to, of course, be at the table, but not dominate the table. So it's not even the case, often when I say tech alone can't fix it, people say, well, of course, we as technologists, we bring in social scientists and political scientists to inform us, but tech is still dominating the table. I believe we need to change that dynamic and have a table that is more even. And why is that? Because in the technology industry, most people swim in the waters of tech optimism, And you don't want to not have optimists, but you need to counter that. And there is a natural tendency for the values of the leaders of companies or the ecosystem to permeate the rest of the ecosystem. And this is a personal opinion, which is, I believe right now the leaders of much of that ecosystem tend towards dataism as opposed to humanism. You can make your own judgment. I personally, the reason I'm standing here is I want to see a world where the human is centered. But I'm not sure everybody agrees with me. And I'm concerned that there is a concentration, by definition, because it's the people who are pushing this the furthest in terms of wanting a different balance there. I think it's really harder for those in power to question what is keeping them in power. Again, human nature. So we desperately need a counterbalance. Within tech, we need to learn how to zoom in and zoom out a little better. We've got to look beyond what we can solve now and be able to zoom out and look longer term at the bigger picture and then zoom in on solutions. And we need to take a different approach to friction. We need to think about sacrificing some speed for intentionality in many of our design choices and how we organize things. And I would like, this is my idealistic slide, which is I would like to think that maybe we can rethink our worshiping of scale and speed. Or not that you don't want, but how we scale and how we move quickly in our organizational design and our system design, because I think the way we're doing it now, the cost is just too high. Pattern recognition, which is part of, again, scaling and speed, is very important in a lot of areas, but we also need to realize that strict pattern recognition can restrict, and that there's a difference between pattern recognition and context. And there are environments where if everything is strict pattern recognition, we really will restrict our view. I mentioned that that scaling fast has a cost in terms of diversity. I believe that formulaic organization and leadership styles don't just cost us in diversity, but cost in terms of trust, deep trust, and power balance, because the more hierarchical it is, the more you have that power imbalance. So what would I like to think that that some of our design values would be around real community, not community being used as many connections as you can, to dignity and reciprocity. We've gotten away from that notion of reciprocity. So maybe we should scale for deep trust. Maybe we should be thinking about 180 people as opposed to 180 characters, and groups in which you actually scaling down, where you actually can have trust, but then you interconnect for common action. And what do some of those organizations, and maybe this comes from, I'm giving away my age, which I already have, but goes back to being involved in the early days of the internet. And the early internet had individual networks that each were diverse, did things in their own way, that interacted with each other for collective or common action. Now, today's internet is not it doesn't look, not exactly, isn't like that. But that internet scaled, and it provided diversity, and it provided trust. And I think we ought to think about how can we incorporate more of that into our current design. So I'll leave you with these words again, and would like to think that maybe you'll look at them and think about them a little bit differently than when I first put them up, and that maybe a word that isn't on there that needs to be on is balance. And that's really what we need to do. We just feel so out of whack that what we need to do is think about how do we get more balance into how we use technology and as a society.